All right, there's President Trump live in Beijing at the state dinner, toasting Xi Jinping, talking about the strength of the two countries and their relationship. Of course, the headlines coming out of the day of meetings show the tensions behind this relationship, and of course, the tension being Taiwan. Joining me now to talk more about what we are watching and this historic situation playing out in front of us is the Gatestone Institute senior fellow, Gordon Chang. And Gordon, we've got to highlight it's not all, rainbows and puppy dogs here in terms of the two countries. Basically, Xi Jinping yesterday warned the president not to get involved in the Taiwan situation and the reunification of Taiwan and China, as the two countries say that they're very warm and have great opportunities together. Your reaction?
I think I think it was very important for President Trump to say those words. The other thing, of course, was the invitation on September 24th. And that is going to be at a time when the United States is in midterm election mode. So it's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of that. And that puts a lot of pressure on President Trump to deliver for the American people out of the China relationship. There have been a number of reports from the White House and from others, and it seems like the meetings are going well at this point. So we'll have to see until the final communique, but it appears that both leaders are getting along well.
Yes, they certainly are, and that's what we just watched on display with the champagne toast. Gordon, what do you make of the group that the president brought with him? These are largely all China-friendly executives, right? You're talking about Apple, which has an enormous business in China, even if it has scaled back a bit. You've got Boeing, who, of course, wants more orders in terms of aerospace from China. You've got Tesla, which, of course, has an enormous business there as well. Your reaction to the group that the president brought along on Air Force One?
Yeah, I don't think the president should have done this. Normally American presidents will bring CEOs to trips to China, but what it does is it weakens President Trump's bargaining position because it tells the Chinese that the U.S. really wants to do business. We know that Xi Jinping has pressured foreign business and especially American business, and we've seen this in various waves, and the last wave starting in March of 2023. Basically, China has pushed American business out, and it's criminalized the gathering of ordinary business information, making it very difficult for Americans to do business there. I think we should be decreasing the vulnerability of American business to China, not increasing it, especially until Xi Jinping pivots and opens the door more to foreign business.
Well, I don't know. I have to push back on that. I mean, President Trump is a deal man. He wants to do a deal on business, and he's probably using those CEOs to distract and, do exactly what you're saying. And that is let Xi Jinping, think about the business opportunities at hand while also angling for whatever the president really wants, which I think is that the president wants Xi Jinping to buy oil from the United States. I mean, this Strait of Hormuz situation is the biggest situation this president has faced at this point. And it's happening just a couple of months before the midterm elections, where affordability was the leading headline. And so we're talking about affordability going into the midterms, where the president could be actually, the Republicans could lose the majority in the House and then stall the president's agenda. And you've got oil prices at 101, right? And so, I think the president is probably trying to get a win here. What would be a win? What would he, do you think, get? If he, in your view, what is a win for the president at this meeting? What do you want him to walk home with?
I think the most important thing would be an extension of the trade truce that President Trump and Xi Jinping negotiated in October in South Korea. Getting China out of the Iran war in the sense of not supporting Iran with weapon sales and with other sales. So that would be important as well. I'd like to see President Trump obtain the release of Jimmy Lai. That is going to be a big win because Lai is a hero of freedom, and he's languishing in a jail in Hong Kong, and he shouldn't be there.
Yeah, and that did come up, by the way. But, Gordon, the New York Times is reporting that Chinese companies have discussed a weapons sale with Iran, sending them through other countries to mask any military aid from the U.S. I mean, we've reported on this many times that China has supported Iran, aided Iran in military defense, whether it's through components or weapons or whatever. And, you know, President Trump broke the news in our interview just 2.5 weeks ago that he sent Xi Jinping a letter saying, do not support Iran in this war. And then Xi Jinping sent him a letter back saying we're not supporting the war. So we still don't have an admission from the Chinese that, in fact, it was and is aiding Iran.
Yes, but we do know that it is. Those anti-ship cruise missiles that Iran fired at the USS Abraham Lincoln and the Carrier Strike Group, those were China's CM-302s. President Trump said they sent 101 of them. Now, fortunately, all of those missiles failed. They were either diverted or they fell into the water. But that is significant from our perspective. I think that it's going to take some pressure from President Trump. I think he'll be able to get China to stop those sales because this is so critical to the U.S. And on those oil sales, I think China did agree to buy U.S. oil, from what we can tell from the White House statement. That is consistent with what we know about what the Chinese need at this moment, because the oil shock in the Chinese economy is significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a big deal because, of course, China will have to pay market prices in terms of buying U.S. oil and gas. You know, China was buying 90% of Iran's oil, and they were paying for it with the yuan. And if China commits to buying oil from the United States, it will be paying market prices like everybody else. Here's a really interesting quote for you from Xi Jinping at the podium a minute ago, Gordon. He says, Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water, Gordon.
Well, you know, the Chinese talk about their principled diplomacy and their red lines, and Taiwan being the most critical red line. But China does not have red lines in reality. Their red lines depend on what they think their bargaining position is at any one particular moment. And so everything is up for negotiation. The Chinese are just trying to intimidate us with those words. President Trump is not intimidated, and we can see this not only in his first term, but his second term as well. And clearly, the United States is not changing its policy, as a White House official privately told a news source in the last 24 hours. That's very good from our perspective.
Absolutely. And of course, while Xi is pushing his commentary and his pressure on Taiwan, President Trump is talking about trade. And there were reports that they held talks on specifics in terms of constructive talks in South Korea, even before this meeting in Beijing. But China is expected to purchase more Boeing planes. They are expected to buy more soybeans and agriculture. And as we mentioned, energy. In exchange for relaxed export controls on semiconductors and rare earth minerals. Look, the rare earth mineral situation was very, very critical going into this meeting before the Iran war, right? Because China was holding back rare earths, not just for the United States, but for the world. China understands that they have a dominant position on these rare earth minerals and magnets that the U.S. needs for its military. I don't know that it's going to be able to bully everybody about these rare earths anymore when now the president has done what he's done in terms of energy, from Venezuela, Iran to Cuba. I think that in and of itself gives the president the upper hand here. What do you think?
Oh, yes. I mean, overall, President Trump came into Beijing holding high cards. And one of them is just oil, as we talked about, and food, because the United States is self-sufficient in both energy and food, and China is not. And with regard to the rare earth near monopoly that China has, yes, it does give it leverage, but President Trump has been working really hard to make sure that we can develop alternatives, that we mine, we process, and we develop the technologies that make rare earths less important. And, you know, in a year or two, maybe 18 months, I think that we won't be talking about China's near monopoly anymore. And I think Xi Jinping understands that as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. Now that the president has accelerated this a return to America supply chain mode, you've got a number of rare earth producers now doing business in Texas, in other areas across the country to excavate those rare earths here. We have them as well. We just need the refining process as well. The top business leaders, along with President Trump, at that dinner right now that we were just looking at live pictures, Nvidia's Jensen Huang, Apple's Tim Cook, Elon Musk, they want to expand China's technology market, Gordon. And I wonder what that means and what that looks like for the United States. I understand the president wants to do lots of business, but this friction that is underway in Silicon Valley, where Jensen Huang wants to send chips to China, he wants the business, but Anthropic and others, Dario Modi from Anthropic says we should not be sending any chips to China because this is a national security issue and we are that close when it comes to AI. We need to win this. We can't give them any advantage from American chips.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This was really highlighted by DeepSeek last year. On January 20, they issued their R1 model. They shook the world. They took trillions of market value off American companies, including Nvidia. And yet in the middle of last year, DeepSeek said that it couldn't come out with its R2 model because it was forced to rely on Huawei's Ascend chip and that they really needed America's chips. And that's a real indication that China can't compete with the United States on AI unless they have access to America's microchips, because that's where our lead is. That's important for us. And I couldn't agree more that we should not be selling advanced chips to China. I actually think we shouldn't be selling any chips, but that's a broader question, but certainly not the advanced chips. There's the issue of the H200s. The United States says it's going to sell them, but I don't know if the Chinese are going to buy them. They want the Blackwell chips.
That's right. The Blackwells are the most advanced, and the president has said no Blackwell chips to China. We'll see if that changes on this trip. But the president said that even before this trip. Gordon, great to get your insights as we watch this historic meeting underway in Beijing. Thank you so much. Gordon Chang joining us. We'll slip in a short break and come right back and continue our live coverage of President Trump's summit in Beijing. Back in a minute.